So they were forced into an attack which they didn't really want to do.
After a week of battle, Egypt's generals were pleased with their progress. They had fortified their positions on the canal and were content with gradually advancing, knowing that in a slow war of attrition their superior numbers would win the day. But Syria's plea for help was too strong to ignore, so on October 14th, Egypt launched a major offensive. At first, things went well for them. The Egyptian army deployed well over 1,200 tanks, and they managed to penetrate 14 miles in one key sector. But the Israelis were prepared, and the fighting was brutal. So brutal that within 12 hours, Egypt had pulled back to their starting point. The Egyptian army had run directly into a wall of artillery, tanks, and infantry lying in ambush. In 12 hours of battle, the Egyptians lost over 250 tanks and suffered more than 1,000 casualties. The IDF claims it lost only 6 tanks. More days of attrition warfare followed. The IDF began preparing a major counteroffensive. By October 15th, Israel was ready for a surprise canal crossing of its own. The plan was conceived by Major General Ariel Sharon, who until July had been the commander of the IDF's southern forces. Sharon's bitter infighting with his replacement, Major General Shmuel Gonen, was part of the controversy that raged in Israel after the war had ended. Sharon and General Ben Adan, the head of the IDF Armored Corps, spearheaded an assault that drove a wedge between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. On October 15th, IDF tanks crossed the canal on rafts to secure a bridgehead. Then combat engineers working under heavy fire began building a bridge across the Suez. IDF forces were attacking hard along the Egyptian line to divert fire from the crossing site. Sharon crossed on October 16th. Renadan's division followed the next day. Not all of his men made it. Egyptian shells hit the bridge and dozens of tanks toppled into the canal. But over 140 tanks had crossed, with each brigade supported by an infantry battalion. The IDF's plan was to trap the Egyptian Third Army between the Israeli forces on the east and west banks of the Suez. Thus began one of the hardest fought battles of the war. The Israelis had adapted to reality and were no longer rushing in with their tanks well ahead of infantry and air support. IDF tanks swept along the banks of the Suez and cut off the supply lines of Egypt's Third Army. But the Egyptians held their ground tenaciously.
Artillery, mass, talking about Atlantic tank attack, it's mass. Humans, soldiers, it's a mass. Anti-tank weapon missiles, that's a mass.
Have the Egyptian casualties been very heavy?
Well, I would say so, yes.
By October 22nd, Egypt began to press for a ceasefire. The IDF used this period to gain as much territory as possible before the superpowers forced an end to the fighting. Even today, Egyptians and Israelis strongly disagree about what happened in this period, how many men were lost, how bad each army's situation was, and ultimately, who won the October War.
With the Israeli troops now in Egypt, on the West Bank, do you still feel that you have a victory?
Yes, of course. If they have enough forces in the Western Bank, why didn't they went to Cairo? Why didn't they take Suez? Why didn't they take Ismailia?
They started their own attacks, but they didn't succeed in making any defeat or making real casualties to our forces in the bridgeheads till they find a small point to attack in it, to move to the other bank, and they succeeded in reaching to the city of Suez, because in this area all our fighting troops were in the east, and some of them has been in the middle way between Cairo and Suez. In the morning they succeeded in entering the city of Suez, and 7 of their tanks are destroyed. After that, they pulled out and never they came back.
On October 24th, a final ceasefire between Egypt, Israel, and Syria took hold. The IDF had crossed into Africa, theoretically surrounding the Egyptians, but Egypt never relinquished the Suez Canal.
The Egyptians think that they succeeded in this war. They think that if they placed some few hundreds of soldiers and tanks in our bank of the canal, then they think that this is a victory for them. And when the Arabs think that they have won or they have a big victory, this encourages them. And the next thing you'll know is that in a year or two, we'll have another war and more casualties.
In fact, just the opposite happened. The carnage of the October War helped to bring about a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, the first between an Arab nation and the Zionist state.
The main phenomenon is that we established friendship between the two nations. Now there is a real friendship between the people of Israel and the people of Egypt.
Friendship was not soon in coming for Israel and Syria. After the October War, Israel pulled back to its 1967 ceasefire lines, but border skirmishes were common, and the two nations battled again during Israel's 1982 war with Lebanon.